Opening the king's diagonal immediately aims for swift development and central influence. Contest for the center is on. Your pawn mirrors white's, fighting for crucial central squares and opening diagonals for bishops. Asserting central pressure, this knight immediately targets black's pawn, setting the stage for active piece development and potential gambits. Developing a knight to its most natural square, this response mirrors white's aggression and prepares for rapid piece deployment. Opens the Ruy-Lopez, immediately creating central tension and eyeballing the pinned knight, a classic strategic battleground. Challenging the bishop's position immediately, black aims to gain space and clarity on the queen side, potentially forcing the bishop to retreat and disrupting white's early development. Retreating the bishop maintains the pin and prepares for development while keeping the pawn structure intact. Initiating central counterplay, the knight boldly advances to challenge white's piece and claim more space. Securing the king's safety in this Ruy-Lopez variation allows white to focus on developing pieces and asserting central influence. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, this develops a piece toward the king side, promoting harmonious coordination. Repositioning the rook to the central file prepares for a pawn push, aiming to disrupt black's development and potentially exploit weaknesses around their king's safety as the game progresses. Boldly challenging the bishop's advanced position, black seeks to gain space on the queen side and potentially dislodge the bishop, though this expansion might create future weaknesses. Recalibrating the bishop's gaze, white subtly repositions the piece, avoiding immediate confrontation while maintaining pressure on the queen side and preserving its value as a long-range attacker, preparing for potential tactical skirmishes down the file or a later central pawn push. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to potentially develop the light-squared bishop without immediate pressure opens up the central diagonal for the queen and could lead to a more compact, defensive structure, aiming to weather white's kingside intentions. Fortifying the center and preparing a pawn storm, this move subtly reinforces white's central presence while simultaneously creating avenues for future pawn pushes, potentially cramping black's queenside mobility and setting up a more robust defensive structure. Castling securely tucks the king away behind a shield of pawns, a vital defensive maneuver that also prepares the rook for potential action on the central files. Prophylaxis is key, aiming to prevent bg4 and potential pressure on the f3 knight while subtly preparing a kingside pawn expansion. Shifting the rook to the open e-file now aims to challenge white's central control and prepare for potential battery formations, subtly reinforcing black's pawn structure against future advances. Unleashing central tension, d4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to crack open the e-file for your rook. This energetic push forces a decision, potentially creating new attacking avenues while also demanding careful calculation regarding the ensuing pawn exchanges and potential tactical skirmishes around the center. Opening up the bishop to g6 offers active counterplay along the a8-h1 diagonal, challenging white's central pawn push and potentially creating future attacking chances against the white king. A calculated redirection, the knight abandons its active post on f3, aiming for a more subtle repositioning on d2, which potentially supports a future e4 pawn push or bolsters the central presence, while also clearing the path for the f-pawn to advance, though it momentarily relinquishes influence over the king side. Shifting the bishop to f8 is a pragmatic retreat, allowing the pawn on e5 to advance and potentially challenging white's central pawn structure, while also preparing for future development or defense of the king side. Opening lines of communication with a bold advance, white seeks to restrict black's queenside mobility and cramp their position, forcing a strategic decision about how to address the encroaching pawn. This central pawn thrust immediately questions the influence of black's bishop on the long diagonal and potentially sets up a future kingside attack by clearing the d-file for potential reinforcements. A curious retreat, the knight embarks on a journey back to its starting rank, a strategic repositioning aimed at reinforcing the pawn chain and potentially rerouting for a counterattacking role on the kingside. This move, while seemingly passive, signals a desire to solidify black's central structure and prepare for future action, perhaps after white commits their own pieces further. It's a patient approach, focusing on structural integrity over immediate confrontation, and anticipates potential pawn breaks from white by ensuring adequate defensive coverage. Repositioning the knight to f1 is a fascinating choice, subtly preparing for a potential kingside expansion or a redeployment to g3, aiming to add pressure on black's queenside development, which has already committed heavily to the queenside. This maneuvering indicates a long-term strategic vision, rather than an immediate tactical strike, perhaps anticipating black's intentions with their pawn structure and seeking to create imbalances. The king's safety is also a consideration. By moving the knight away from the potential e5-e4 pawn push, it indirectly bolsters the defensive setup around white's monarch, although the queenside remains the primary theater of operations. It's a quiet, unassuming maneuver that speaks volumes about white's positional understanding and patience. Bringing the knight back to d7 is a flexible repositioning, aiming to support a potential pawn push on e5 or to reroute the knight via f8 to either g6 or h5, creating new attacking avenues. Shifting the knight to h2 hints at a potential kingside pawn storm development, aiming to create attacking chances against black's castled position, while the g-pawn remains uncommitted. Boldly challenging white's pawn chain, black initiates a dynamic confrontation on the queenside, aiming to shatter the central control and unleash piece activity that has been somewhat stifled. This thrust forces a decision from white, either reinforcing the pawn center or allowing black to gain a foothold and potentially open lines for counterplay. The maneuver signals black's intent to break out of the passive setup and inject some much-needed dynamism into the position. Breaking open the center with the pawn capture dramatically alters the board's dynamic, creating an immediate imbalance and inviting tactical skirmishes as white aims to leverage the free d-file for his rooks. The immediate recapturing of the pawn with the bishop fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening the c-file and establishing a strong diagonal presence for black's queen's bishop, potentially targeting white's kingside in the future. Elevating the bishop to g5 immediately targets black's queenside development, implicitly threatening to disrupt the pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities on the d-file should the bishop be exchanged. Unyielding defense solidifies the queen's protective circle, preparing to contest the central d-file and maintain vital pawn structure integrity, while subtly repositioning for future queenside counterplay. A tactical redirection opens up new attacking avenues. Unleashing a pawn storm, black boldly expands on the queenside, seeking to challenge white's central control and open lines for bishop and rook activity. Shedding the bishop pair here is a calculated concession of a key positional advantage, likely aimed at disrupting black's queenside pawn structure and potentially opening lines for a future kingside assault. White forgoes the bishop pair's long-term potential for immediate, if subtle, disruption, banking on the created weaknesses to outweigh the positional concession. Reclaiming the knight to its natural outpost, the black queen finds a more secure footing and prepares for potential counterplay on the kingside, while the white pawn structure, now slightly compromised, might offer future targets. Suddenly, the knight leaps into a more active central role, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed nature of black's king and create immediate threats on the kingside, potentially forcing concessions or initiating a tactical skirmish. Recapturing with the knight directly addresses the immediate threat to the king's safety, simplifying the position while acknowledging the loss of the advanced knight's outpost potential. Opening the h-file to target the enemy king presents an immediate tactical opportunity, but simultaneously compromises your own kingside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses that black can exploit later. Black boldly confronts the bishop on b3, initiating a dynamic pawn thrust that seeks to destabilize white's queenside and open lines for attack. This ambitious advance forces white to make a decision regarding their valuable bishop, potentially disrupting its defensive post and creating new imbalances on the board. Shifting the bishop back to c2 aims to reinforce the pawn chain and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm, while also defending against black's increasing queenside influence, by keeping an eye on the d5 square. Challenging the e4 pawn's advance and preparing to storm the kingside, this maneuver simultaneously aims to weaken the white king's pawn shield. Securing the pawn structure on the queenside by advancing this flank pawn creates a more solid barrier, preventing black's pieces from easily infiltrating and simultaneously preparing potential advances like b4 to gain more territory. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal power, black aims to activate its dormant potential, hoping to disrupt white's meticulously constructed pawn chain and potentially prepare for a queenside expansion. Rad1 aggressively asserts control over the open d-file, establishing a vital central presence and preparing for potential pawn pushes like d5, or even a direct assault on the weakened kingside structure created by black's g6. Safeguarding the monarch from the imminent threats posed by white's advanced pieces becomes paramount, especially considering the open diagonal pointing towards black's king. Refocusing the bishop to the a2-g8 diagonal aims to reclaim central influence and pressure black's queenside pawn structure, a subtle maneuver seeking to exploit the lack of piece mobility for black's knight on d7 and the compromised pawn shield around the black king. A thoughtful repositioning of the rook, preparing to contest the open f-file should white's structure allow, and also offering a retreat square if the queenside becomes too hot to handle. Preparing for a flank pawn storm's impact, the bishop retreats from the immediate attack, safeguarding the pawn on a3 and repositioning for potential central or queenside play, while simultaneously maintaining a defensive grip on the queenside diagonal. Unlocking the d-file requires a commitment, and bringing the other rook to bear suggests a desire to challenge white's control and open lines towards the monarch. A daring foray into enemy territory, this bishop redeployment aims to disrupt black's nascent queenside initiative and directly challenge the control of the d5 square, potentially creating weaknesses around the black king. A seemingly passive retreat for the bishop, bd* aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances, while repositioning the bishop to a less exposed square after white's aggressive pawn push. Steering the rook toward the kingside hints at a potential repositioning for central control or a flanking maneuver, preparing to support a d5 pawn push or to join an assault on black's kingside defenses. Recentering the queen to c8 allows it to survey the queenside and potentially support a breakthrough on the file, while simultaneously creating a defensive network around the king. A curious repositioning of the knight, aiming to shuffle it over to the kingside, perhaps for a future attacking foray after the queenside dust settles. The bishop retreats, offering a tantalizing glimpse of open lines for the rook on the d-file, but simultaneously sacrificing the initiative on the kingside, potentially allowing white's knight to penetrate further into the enemy camp unchecked. Reinforcing the central d-file with this rook transfer offers a flexible pivot, potentially preparing a later advance of the knight or creating simultaneous pressure on black's somewhat uncoordinated pieces, all while maintaining a solid defensive posture for white's own king. The knight on e7 seeks to bolster the beleaguered kingside defenses, anticipating a potential thrust from white's knight now residing on h2, and also to offer a sanctuary should the bishop on g5 prove too bothersome. Repositioning the bishop to the a2 square aims to untangle white's queenside pieces, offering a slightly improved perspective on the central squares and potentially preparing for a more active role. Seeking to shore up defenses and perhaps create a future outpost for the knight, h6 aims to prevent a kingside pawn storm or escape squares for white's pieces. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure, this advance, while seemingly passive, aims to create a defensive bulwark, preventing black's knights from infiltrating vulnerable squares. It's a prophylactic measure, anticipating potential threats on the g-file and creating an escape route for the king via the newly formed g2 square. Prioritizing king's safety amid the central pawn chain's immobility proves astute. Tucking away from potential diagonal threats and clearing escape routes becomes paramount as the rooks prepare their eventual deployment. Shifting the monarch offers a measure of security, subtly improving its defensive posture behind the pawn shield while preparing for potential future maneuvers, possibly a repositioning to the h-file or a more centralized role should the strategic landscape allow. Challenging the pawn chain's integrity, this pawn thrust immediately injects dynamism into the queenside and aims to pry open lines. Opening the g-file is a risky gamble, exposing your king to a potential onslaught from black's bishop on h6 and rook on d8. But it also creates an immediate tactical opportunity by forcing black to react to the open lines and potentially disrupting their piece coordination. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, black ignites the kingside, aiming to dismantle white's defensive structure and create counterplay. The bishop's retreat to d5 reestablishes pressure along the open d-file, aiming to disrupt black's potentially awkward pawn formation on the kingside and exploit the slight weakness created by the prior pawn pushes. Unleashing the pawn storm, black courageously pushes his f-pawn, aiming to shatter white's defensive structure and expose the vulnerable king. This aggressive pawn thrust creates immediate tactical complications, demanding precise calculation from white to navigate the ensuing chaos. Challenging the exposed black king by igniting the kingside attack is the immediate goal, but the queen's repositioning also prepares to exploit the weakened g-file if black cannot adequately shore up their defenses. The bishop's retreat to e8 seems to acknowledge the immediate pressure on the g6 pawn and the exposed king, but it surrenders valuable central influence and leaves the knight on f6 somewhat adrift, unable to participate effectively in the defense or counterattack. Shifting the queen to threaten a kingside advance opens avenues for a forceful pawn storm, aiming to shatter black's defensive structure and expose their monarch. Shifting the bishop to this active diagonal potentially prepares to exploit the open g-file, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn structure against any immediate tactical incursions by the white queen or knights. Bringing the rook to the open file aims to increase attacking pressure on black's king, potentially setting up a future breakthrough or forcing concessions. A subtle repositioning of the king aims to sidestep the potential pressure building on the g-file, seeking a more secure haven while keeping an eye on the central action. Pivoting the queen to the g-file immediately challenges black's vulnerable kingside pawn structure and threatens a swift invasion, forcing black to reckon with the king's compromised safety. Trading queens now opens up the kingside for white's knights, potentially creating dangerous attacking avenues. The exchange of knights opens up the h-file for the white king, introducing a potential weakness that black will now endeavor to exploit by generating pressure against it. Creating a salient outpost on the h-file, black proactively contests the open terrain now that the critical g-file has been neutralized, aiming to disrupt white's structural integrity and prepare for potential kingside advances or even a daring pawn storm. The knight retreats, seeking a more secure outpost as the central pawns begin to fall away, potentially opening lines for action. Opening the kingside is a desperate gamble, seeking to disrupt white's solid structure and create counterplay. Black hopes the exposed f-file will destabilize white's queen or create tactical chances for their own rooks, but it also risks weakening their own king further and gifting white control of the crucial central files. Opening the f-file now unleashes significant pressure, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed monarch and the potential weakness of the g6 pawn. Pushing the pawn forward with this advance dramatically alters the pawn structure, aiming to pry open lines near white's king and create immediate attacking chances. This pawn capture dramatically alters the kingside pawn structure, ripping open the h-file and potentially creating a dangerous outpost for black's knight on h4, while simultaneously exposing white's king to further threats. Unleashing a bold counterattack, this rook sacrifices itself on the f-file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create chaos around the enemy monarch. Unleashing the rook to the third rank opens a vital diagonal for the queen and prepares for a potential invasion of black's queenside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure created by black's aggressive pawn pushes. Seizing the open h-file with the rook now dramatically alters the complexion of the position, creating immediate threats against white's exposed king and potentially opening lines for black's other pieces to participate in the attack. Initiating a counterthrust towards the black king's weakened pawn shield, this maneuver seeks to exploit the open g-file, creating immediate threats and disrupting black's defensive setup. The immediate aggressive check forces white's king to scurry, but the real story here is the exposed g4 pawn and the open h-file. Black's rook is now actively participating in the attack, eyeing vulnerable squares and potentially setting up a follow-up sacrifice or penetration. White's king is far from safe, and the pawn structure around it has been significantly weakened. The king's journey from relative safety to the heart of the action is now complete, initiating a desperate attempt to solidify the defensive structure, though the open files still present a persistent threat to the monarch. Opening the f-file with the rook is a bold attempt to stir up activity against white's somewhat exposed king, aiming to create tactical chances through its newly available avenues. Initiating a rook lift offers a dynamic shift, aiming to reposition the piece to a more active square and potentially contest the open file or support a pawn push. Exchanging the rook on the open file simplifies into an endgame where white's knight on h2 is poised to become very active, potentially supporting breakthroughs or tying down black's weakened pawns. Securing the king's safety after the exchange on g4 marks a crucial transition towards a likely endgame, where the remaining pawns and active pieces will dictate the game's outcome. Shifting the bishop to d8 feels like a desperate attempt to find a safer harbor for this piece, but it leaves the kingside pawns exposed and doesn't address the fundamental weakness of the isolated g-pawn. The decision to activate the rook on the third rank aims to bring it into the center of the action, potentially targeting the d-file or preparing to support a central pawn push, while also freeing up the knight on h2. Unlocking the c-file with this check creates immediate tactical possibilities, forcing white's king into an even more exposed position and potentially disrupting their defensive setup by drawing the bishop away from its guard. The king retreats to a slightly safer square, aiming to consolidate the position and prepare for potential exchanges or a shift in focus towards the queenside where black's advanced pawns pose a threat. The rook's advance to f4 effectively contests the semi-open file, a crucial battleground now that the central pawns are exchanged, forcing white to seriously consider defending their vulnerable king. Initiating an aggressive pawn thrust towards the enemy king's shadows, a bold attempt to pry open lines for the remaining pieces. A bold choice, prioritizing immediate opposition and a potential breakthrough against white's centralized king, though it leaves the pawn chain on the kingside quite exposed. Seeking to finally activate the pinned knight, white repositioned it, hoping to escape its passive stance on the h-file and potentially participate in the fight for central squares or even the kingside if an opportunity arises. Challenging the bishop on d5 directly is a wise decision. This piece has been a thorn in black's side, preventing effective piece coordination. By forcing a reaction now, black aims to disrupt white's defensive structure and potentially open lines for counterplay, hoping to avoid being slowly squeezed. Repositioning the knight to d2 aims to fortify the kingside pawn structure and potentially redeploy the knight to f3 or e4, offering better defensive and offensive capabilities. Sacrificing the rook to break open lines around the white king presents a dynamic challenge for white, forcing them to navigate a suddenly precarious position. The king's safety, once a fortress, is now a glaring vulnerability. Bringing it towards the fray invites further complications and potential tactical traps, especially with black's pieces poised to exploit any lack of support. Clearing the rook from that precarious central square aims to activate it on the second rank, potentially supporting advances or contesting open files as the endgame approaches. Shifting the king to the third rank offers a potential escape from the dangerous bishop's diagonal, aiming to solidify its position before the imminent pawn storm or potential knight activation. The relentless pursuit of the king continues, forcing white into a defensive crouch as black's pieces swarm. The king's repositioning seeks to escape the immediate discovered attack and prepare to support the d-pawn, though it leaves him somewhat exposed on the light squares. The persistent repetition of the rook on the second rank indicates a clear intention to force a draw, recognizing that further pawn play is unlikely to yield an advantage and could even be risky. Repositioning the king to the king's flank, this maneuver aims to consolidate the position and prepare for potential pawn advances, while also offering a safer haven from the active opposing rook. A final flourish, this check forces a king repositioning and potentially simplifies the position further, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch in the ensuing exchanges. Pushing the king deeper into this highly contested center, a daring gambit to reignite the offense by forcing exchanges and potentially opening critical lines for attack. A desperate sortie, this bishop's thrust seeks to disrupt white's consolidating kingside presence and perhaps force a perpetual check, though its long-term impact is questionable given black's compromised pawn structure and the exposed king. Probing for any weaknesses in black's currently very active queen and bishop formation, white repositions the king to a more central square, potentially preparing to join the fight on the kingside or even support a pawn push. Exerting pressure on the kingside with the rook now, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats or open lines towards the white monarch. Forces a king retreat from a potentially dominant central square, aiming to regroup and exploit the exposed black monarch. Sensing a glimmer of hope, the black king charges into the fray, a bold gambit to disrupt white's centralized control and potentially unravel the seemingly solid pawn structure. The knight repositions, seeking fresh avenues of influence, perhaps to bolster the king's defense or to contest the d-file, a testament to white's patient maneuvering in this complex endgame. The bishop now eyes the kingside, seeking any weakness in white's still somewhat exposed monarch after the pawn storm subsided. Seeking to solidify the knight's influence and reposition it to a more active square. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's mating net and buy some time, forcing the king to move, though the structural damage is too severe to recover from. Protecting the king with the knight is a necessary defensive measure, but it leaves a crucial diagonal open and doesn't address the immediate threat of the black bishop's advanced position. The black bishop, with a flourish, interrupts white's consolidation, seeking to disrupt the now exposed king and potentially create an endgame advantage through perpetual checks if white isn't careful.